North Korea, or the DPRK, has fired another missile, but this one, an intercontinental missile, is reported to be capable of reaching all of the U.S. mainland. The White House says Trump emphasized that China must use all available levers to convince North Korea to end its provocations and to return to the path of denuclearization. In this edition of the debate, we ask, was North Korea on this path? Furthermore, why does the U.S. continue with its joint military war games when it knows it irritates North Korea?
Following two long-range launches earlier this year, North Korea's tested an ICBM, which flew more than 4,000 kilometers. That places the U.S. mainland in range of its missiles. North Korea later declared itself a nuclear weapons state. South Korea and several other countries responded with condemnation, vowing to ramp up hardline efforts to get Pyongyang to give up its nuclear and missile programs.
This action not only increases tension on the Korean peninsula, but gravely endangers international peace and security. We strongly condemn North Korea for continuing such reckless behavior. South Korea and the United States, along with the international community, have no other choice but to continue applying strong pressure and sanctions.
Minutes after the North Korean launch, South Korea conducted its own missile exercise. Pyongyang's test also comes after the announcement of large-scale U.S.-South Korea military drills to take place December 4th to 8th, involving 230 planes and nuclear-capable aircraft. Analysts argue North Korea may be seeking to increase its bargaining position with the latest test.
I think that North Korea intends to use this missile launch to declare the completion of its nuclear force in 2017, based on their missile's range, and through this declaration bolster its strategic position in its standoff or potential negotiations with the U.S., then try to break through the international sanctions against it.
North Korea's launch comes following a 75-day gap from its previous test, with many suggesting there may have been an opening for negotiations. North Korea's missile launch early Wednesday, together with U.S. plans to conduct large-scale Air Force drills with South Korea in December, heightened tensions on the Korean Peninsula. The moves also precede the Pyeongchang Winter Olympic Games set for February and dampen hopes for a so-called Olympic truce. Frank Smith, Press TV, Seoul.
Our guest joining us for this edition of the debate, we have Michael Lane, geopolitical and security analyst, who joins us from Washington, D.C. And also we have Jason Unruhe, political commentator and analyst, who joins us from Ontario. I'd like to welcome you both. And Michael Lane, let me start with you. If the capabilities of this ballistic missile is true, as reported, reaching all of the U.S. mainland, do you think that this is a game changer?
I think the reports probably are true. Certainly the test looked to be very much a success, and it's the new Hwasong 15, which has the enhanced capabilities of distance and height. So I think that, that the reports are probably true. The only caveat is there's no evidence yet that North Korea has been able to miniaturize the warhead and come up with something lighter than the big heavy nuclear ones that they've been playing with so far. And that means that the missile will have some reduced range. It will still be able to hit the United States, but perhaps not the East Coast. Therefore, it's a semi-game changer, not a complete game changer. It certainly puts the world on notice. It puts the United States on notice that North Korea is advancing their nuclear program and their ballistic missile program faster than anyone had predicted, faster than had been anticipated. But we are likely still a year or two away from the successful miniaturization of a nuclear warhead that will complete the entire game-change analysis.
Well, that's interesting. Jason Unruhe, Michael Lane making that statement that a year, perhaps 2 years away, that's quite a bit of a time there to leave both sides to do, in a sense, what they would like to do. One maybe to be the one who is the one taking action, the other reacting.
Oh, yes, I would definitely agree with his assessment for the most part. It definitely, this does put the world on notice. This is a significant advance, and there's no concrete proof yet that some kind of mobile, nuclear bomb can be placed on the missile yet. But this is certainly a significant step forward, perhaps even the biggest step in this situation is trying to actually reach the full mainland United States. Now it's no longer simply just a matter of the coast being within firing range. Now most of the United States is. I've seen at least one estimate by the BBC that shows that the missile could probably reach as far as even Mexico if for some reason they would want to fire that. But that certainly does demonstrate the tremendous capability that has been made here. And it could be a year, maybe two, before it's fully capable of being nuclear. But the international community thus far has underestimated the DPRK in the past. But who really knows, because we don't have access to the exact level of their technological development.
Well, let's take a look at some of the reactions, Michael Lane, coming through it. And first, the U.S. reaction and the U.S. President Donald Trump. He said initially when he heard about the news, we'll take care of it. Then the White House saying that Trump has emphasized that China must use all of its means to convince North Korea to end, I guess, its tests. What does that tell you in terms of the U.S. reaction?
Well, yes. You know, President Trump and President Xi have had multiple conversations on this since President Trump took office. President Trump always comes away from those discussions with a good feeling that he's gotten the commitment from President Xi to really use all of China's influence to rein in the North Koreans and their nuclear weapons program. But in the days that follow these discussions, it always turns out that perhaps the agreement was not as ironclad, or China was not as direct or as strong in following out the agreements to rein in the North Koreans as President Trump had hoped. Well, we had yet another conversation this morning between President Trump and President Xi, in which apparently they've both agreed that enhanced sanctions will continue, that new sanctions will be applied. Perhaps this will finally bring China to cutting off the energy supplies that seem to always be able to sneak through and keep the North Korean economy afloat. Perhaps not, we'll see. But the whole world, including the United Nations, and interestingly, even the Kremlin condemned this particular test as provocative. And so it would seem that as the sanctions tighten and as they go on, that the noose is slowly tightening around North Korea's neck to the point where it may want to consider negotiations.
Well, Jason Unruhe, the statement that I asked Michael Lane in response from the U.S. that China must use all of its means to convince North Korea to end its nuclear test was just half of the sentence. The other half is what is quite interesting. The U.S. saying that in order for North Korea to return to the path of denuclearization, was North Korea on the path to denuclearization?
I sincerely doubt that the DPRK is not going to give up its nuclear capability at this time. They have absolutely no reason to do so. The United States is still an imperialist power, which is constantly threatening them, which is putting sanctions against them, which is trying to harm their economy, sabotage it. Is constantly making threats, geopolitical maneuvers to try to just destabilize, if not destroy, the country. So the DPRK really has no reason to get rid of the nuclear power that it has. And frankly, it's not going to give it up. The DPRK, so long as it exists, is going to be a nuclear armed state to some degree or another, depending on their level of technological development, as a necessary precondition to defend themselves from any kind of physical military hostility that's being carried out against the country. So realistically, the DPRK is not going to give up its nukes anytime soon, or even in the foreseeable future.
Well, it's certainly a chess game, and this perhaps is truly reflected, Michael Lane, and what the South Korean president has said, Moon Jae-in. He said that we must stop a situation where North Korea miscalculates and threatens us with nuclear weapons, or where the United States considers a preemptive strike. I think those are the two key points here that could perhaps then engage both in a miscalculation of one form or another. Do you think that that probability is very high?
I don't think it's very high, but I think we're inexorably, slowly inching closer to it on a day-by-day basis. Nothing is imminent. I don't think that that the Trump administration feels that the nuclear threat against the United States is imminent, and so therefore a preemptive strike is probably not in the cards for the foreseeable months, even a year. But it depends on how much progress North Korea makes in their nuclearization and their delivery abilities to the point where perhaps we will be on the precipice of a preemptive strike.
Well, Jason Unruhe, this idea of denuclearization was also repeated by Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who said diplomatic options remain viable. This is based on his reaction to the intercontinental ballistic missile test, the one that just happened. And he said that the option remains viable and open, urging a peaceful path to denuclearization. The U.S.'s ultimate goal here is for that path to be traveled on. But, as you mentioned, there are no indications that North Korea would ever do that. Does China have that kind of leverage on North Korea to push it down that path? Or is this test for North Korea to have leverage in talks and negotiations?
I sincerely doubt that China ultimately has the power to force the DPRK to get rid of its nuclear weapons. If they're willing to survive the arduous march, if they're willing to take that, then there's basically nothing short of a nuclear holocaust against them that could actually stop them from doing what it is they want to do. One of the hallmarks of the DPRK is that they have been determined to forge their own path regardless of what anyone tries to do them. Even during the Sino-Soviet split, the DPRK refused to take a line on Marxism, Leninism versus Maoism and instead advocated the idea of Juche. Even with their two biggest allies at the time, they were still insistent upon having their own course of development and will make their own decisions for themselves. And that is primarily with its ideology right now, Juche Sangban, that they are going to put the military first and their independence first above everything else. And that seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to do when you have a great deal of hostile foreign actors standing against you, even people who claim to be their allies like China and Russia. The DPRK has every right to forge its own path, regardless of any pressures that are being placed on it by other countries.
When Rex Tillerson recently visited South Korea, Michael Lane, there was an interesting statement that came out from the Pentagon, and that was only a ground invasion can destroy North Korean nuclear program. Does that sound like really an option that the U.S. may be considering or as having as an option for a plan to, as it said, destroy North Korean nuclear program?
Well, once upon a time in a previous life, I worked in the planning department at the Pentagon, and so I can assure you that the Pentagon has a plan for almost everything. And it would shock me if they do not have a currently updated, upgraded plan to do just what you're talking about. However, the realistic probability of doing it, the will to implement something like that, the devastation, the difficulty that would result in that whole thing, it makes it an option that no one really wants to pursue. So it's possible. There's absolutely a plan for something like that, as there's a plan for everything. But I would be surprised to see it being elevated to serious discussion at this point in time. Things would have to deteriorate a lot worse before that kind of intervention. I think we're more likely in the short term being defined as up to the point where the North Koreans successfully miniaturize a warhead. I think we're likely to see increased sanctions, increased enforcement of the sanctions. The two things that they still have a little bit of access to are international banking and energy. I would expect to see more clamps down on that. Do whatever you can to so debilitate North Korea's ability to function and operate in the world that they begin to consider other options. I don't know that they will, but that kind of deterioration and debilitation is what it's going to take.
Well, let's see here, Jason Unruhe. Trump has said additional major sanctions will be imposed on North Korea today. Wednesday is the date that he called it. But how have sanctions worked out so far, Jason Unruhe? We know that sanctions upon sanctions have been placed on North Korea. by the UN, the U.S., and a week earlier, North Korea, by the U.S., was listed as a state sponsor of terrorism. Do you think these actions help?
Well, these actions don't help the diplomatic process, but they certainly do help in pressuring the DPRK. These sanctions have been quite damaging, and this is really nothing new for them. They've experienced these before. They've experienced far worse, and they've been willing to live through it. But the U.S. can put as many sanctions on the DPRK as they want and can cause as much harm to the North Korean people as they want. But in the end, they're not going to give up. They are going to maintain their own path regardless of what the United States does, even if it comes to something like the situation with Iraq, where the sanctions on the Saddam Hussein government ended up costing the lives of 500,000 children. The DPRK is not going to give up, and that's something that I don't think the United States really understands, that even with all the effort that can be put forward in trying to destabilize the government, they are simply not going to surrender. They're not like any other state around the world that simply has a particular bourgeois ruling class that will fight tooth and nail to preserve their own profitability, even at the expense of some kind of nationalist identity. The DPRK is quite different in this regard, economically and politically, and they are not going to bow to pressures the same way that you would have any other country.
Michael Lane, I think Jason Unruhe mentioned that the relationship between China and North Korea, or that China does not have as much influence on North Korea as perhaps is perceived. Plenty of indications out there from reports that indicate this relationship is losing steam. Do you think that China is actually not as strong in terms of its influence over North Korea? Or is it just putting this facade, but really this relationship is something that China wants to keep and is into having support for North Korea, using it as a leverage perhaps against the U.S. for political gains?
All right, well, first, China certainly has more influence over the North Koreans than anyone else does, and probably more than everyone else combined does. So I think it's probably correct to say that you can't just snap your fingers, or China cannot just snap its fingers and North Korea will do everything it says. They're allies, and North Korea is a client state. That doesn't mean that it's a satellite state, that it does everything it's told to. It certainly is in China's bigger interest, in my estimation, for North Korea to remain a viable, difficult situation for the United States. And maintaining the ability of North Korea to be a difficult distraction for the United States is in China's interest. What is not in China's interest is an all-out war on the peninsula. That will create havoc not only on the peninsula, but the amount of refugees and the spillover of the war into China is something that I think they would like to avoid at all costs. So it's a matter of playing the game up to but not crossing over, and ensuring that the war doesn't break out. And when you've got multiple parties that are all part of it, the Koreans, the United States, its allies, China, Russia, the possibility for miscalculation is certainly high.
Jason Unruhe, what do the neighbors of North Korea in that region think when you have these tensions that have been ratcheted up so high, with the presence in particular of U.S. in the region? And of course, U.S. is reaping one of the rewards that it's reaping is how this area is becoming militarized in terms of U.S. Weapons sales. Do you think that North Korea's neighbors are looking at this situation where they are looking to China and wondering why China is not reeling this situation in? And in turn, how do they view the U.S. in the region, their presence in the region?
Well, I'm sure a lot of them are looking towards China to wield more influence against the DPRK. But while China does have the influence, it's a matter of whether or not that influence is going to work. the DPRK is very, very belligerent in its desire to defend itself. And I think the situation has escalated a lot of other tensions in the region as well. With the weapon sales to other countries within Asia, there has always been not always, but in recent years, there has been the competing spheres of influence between the United States and China in the region. Most of Asia is largely considered by China to be its backyard, and the U.S. would be considered to be intruding upon that. And the hostilities between the DPRK and the U.S. do have broader implications than merely just the two countries themselves. But they are a political situation that spills over into other countries inside the region who may or may not at some point be forced to pick a side in the conflict. And if that truly does become the case, many of them will side with the United States merely due to the economic influence that the United States wields in the world.
Okay, I got 30 seconds to give to you, Michael Lane. You said once upon a time you were part of the Pentagon. Who's going to call the shot if there's going to be a war?
President Trump has an excellent national security team led by General Mattis and Secretary Tillerson. General McMaster at the National Security Council is also well, as don't forget to add the Chief of Staff, former Marine General John Kelly. That's a foursome that is highly respected and highly trusted by the President. I think that when they come to a consensus recommendation, the President is likely to follow it.
Okay, we're going to have to end it there. Let me thank our guests for this edition of the debate. Michael Lane, the geopolitical and security analyst who once upon a time worked for the Pentagon. Also, Jason Unruhe, a political commentator and analyst who is from Ontario, who spoke to us. Thanks so much for tuning in to another edition of the debate. For me, Kavitavwe, and the entire team in the capital, Tehran. It's goodbye.